Greetings, Math 10 students. In this video we're going to take a look at multiplying polynomials. This is section 7.4 from the textbook. And I actually have split this video into two parts, part 1 and part 2. This is part 1. Just for time I split it into two parts, so you can go ahead and watch them sequentially or one at a time. To begin with, I'm assuming that you know some basic concepts having to do with polynomials. You're familiar with what they are and some terminology, things like term, coefficient, base, and exponent. I'm assuming that you're familiar with those words and what they mean. If not, please go ahead and check out the video on section 7.2, the basic introduction to polynomials, just to familiarize yourself with those things. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started and take a look at what multiplying polynomials involves. And to begin with, we're just going to multiply two terms together. See what happens when we're just multiplying two terms. And when we're multiplying larger polynomials, this is going to be the basic process that we do for each term. So here are two terms of polynomials. And remember, each term has a coefficient, base, an exponent, and these particular terms have two bases, the x and the y, and that's okay. The first term in parentheses here is negative 3x to the fourth power y squared, or to the second power, and then the second term is negative x to the second power y. And I know it's multiplication because, first of all, it says so at the top of the slide here, but more importantly, since you won't always have that, there's nothing between the parentheses here. There's no plus or minus sign. So that tells me it's a multiplication. And basically, you're just going to use the multiplication rule for exponents that we learned way back in section 7.1 a week or so ago. And I like to make a little mental checklist here when I'm multiplying these things so that I don't lose track of everything. And my checklist says this: okay, there's a lot of pieces to keep track of here, but if I just look at them one at a time, I'll avoid making mistakes. First thing to remember is that more mistakes are made with signs than anything else. So every time you multiply two terms, make sure that you're applying the sign rules for multiplication. Those are the ones that say a negative times a negative is a positive, and so on. And positive times negative is a negative. If you don't have these memorized yet, that's okay. Just make sure they're somewhere in your notes so that you can see them easily. You can use a calculator for this. It's nice to have them memorized at some point, though. It's going to make things go more quickly. So sign rules for multiplication. Next, I'm going to multiply my coefficients. And if you don't remember, those are the numbers that are on the ground floor in front of your variables. This particular term doesn't have a coefficient, so I can slide a 1 in there. My coefficient is 1. And then I'm going to add the exponents of like bases. Now, it's important to consciously think about each of these three parts of the process, because when we're multiplying polynomials, especially some of the longer ones, you'll see that there are just a lot of steps. And all the steps are pretty straightforward. It's always going to be these things right here on the checklist, but you're going to be doing it multiple times. And if it's for a Hawks assignment, if you make one little mistake with a minus sign, it makes the whole thing wrong. And you want to avoid that. So just make sure that you're consciously thinking about each of these things. So let's work through this one. Sign rules for multiplication. Well, I have a negative times a negative, so my answer will be positive. For this particular one, I don't need to write the plus sign in front. I can get rid of it at the end. So check, that's done. I did my sign rules. Notice I didn't even mention any of the numbers yet. I'm just thinking through the signs first so that I don't forget them or don't make any mistakes with them. Next, I'm going to multiply my coefficients. So I've got a 3 and a 1. 3 times 1 is 3. Check. Great. I already done 2 of the 3 steps. That's perfect. Now I'm going to add the exponents of like bases. Now I mentioned that each of these things in parentheses is just one term. I neglected to remind you guys that how do I know it's just one term in there? It's because there's no plus or minus signs between any of the variables or numbers in here. This 3x to the fourth y squared, there's no addition or subtraction signs in there, so that's all kind of glommed together as one big multiplication. So I know that this is just all one term. It has two bases, but that's okay. I'm going to take the bases one at a time. So the x base first has an exponent of 4 here, and that's going to combine with the x to the second power. Those both have the same base. Typically in polynomials, your bases will be variables. So since they have the same base, I'll add the exponents. So 4 plus 2 gives me an exponent of 6. I keep the base x, I just bring it down. So I just added 4 and 2, and I got 6. Now I've got another pair of bases here to deal with, the y's. I've got y to the second power and y here doesn't have an exponent. If I don't see an exponent, I just put a 1 there. So that's y to the first power. So go ahead and think through, what do you think I'm going to write next here? Okay, given that it says I have to add the exponents, I'm going to add 2 plus 1, and that's going to give me y to the third power. I don't write any plus or minus sign between the x and the y. I don't need a number in here, anything like that. This is all just one term. And I don't have to write the plus sign if it's the very first term, so 3x to the sixth y to the third power would be my final answer there. There were no plus or minus signs between the x's up here, so you don't put any down here. Alright, let's take a look at what happens when I multiply a one-term polynomial by another polynomial with maybe more than one term. What am I going to do? I'm going to distribute. So here's an example. I have one term right here multiplied by this set of parentheses, which has a lot of terms in it. In fact, the terms are separated by plus and minus signs. That's what makes it a distinct term. So my first term inside the parentheses is 3x to the fourth y with no exponent, so I put a little 1 there. My second term is this negative 6x. Again, there's no exponent with the x, so I can put a 1. Y to the second power. I know it's a new term because there's a minus sign. That sign separates the terms. The next term is right here, negative 2x to the third power. And then I see a plus sign, so new term plus y to the third power. And again, there's no coefficient, there's no number in front of the y, so I can put a little 1. Make sure you understand why there are 4 distinct separate terms in that set of parentheses. I know it's multiply because there's the term in front here is touching the parentheses. There's no plus or minus sign between them. The directions will typically tell you to multiply, but it's good to be able to recognize that it's a multiplication just from the symbols as well. Alright, so how am I going to do this? I'm going to take the term touching the parentheses and distribute it to each term in the parentheses. That means the thing that we just did a moment ago on the last slide, I've got to do that 4 times in a row. So you can start to see why I am encouraging you to think of this as a checklist. You want to make sure that you get every detail right because you're doing these 3 things 4 times in a row, and any one little mistake can make the whole thing wrong in Hawks. Hawks doesn't give partial credit for these. So if you do everything right but just mess up one minus sign or forget to add one pair of exponents, it's wrong. So just be very careful and meticulous. And if you need to make a little checklist with these 3 things and actually just check off on it, that's fine. You don't have to necessarily write it out, but I encourage you to at least think about these 3 things very thoughtfully and consciously when you're multiplying through. So let's distribute. I'm going to take this first term, I'm going to multiply it here, the first term in the second set of parentheses. And I ignore everything else. Now I'm just running through my checklist. Okay, sign rules. Negative times positive is negative. Multiply my coefficients. Okay, 4 times 3 is 12. Notice I didn't even pay attention to any of the numbers when I did the sign rules. I'm not caring about the x's or y's yet when I multiply the 4 times 3. Now I move on to my like bases. So I've got x and x, add the exponents. 2 plus 4 will give me x to the 6th power. And then the same thing with the y's. I don't see a power or an exponent with the y here, so I'll put a 1. And now when I multiply, I add the exponent, so y to the 1 plus 1 will give me power of 2. Great. I'm done with this first term. I get to do that whole process all over again, now multiplying by this second term. So I'm taking the guy in front, the negative 4x to the second power, y to the first power, and multiplying it by negative 6x to the first power, y to the second power. Just to test yourself, pause the video here and see if you can come up with that, the result of that multiplication. You're going to be going through all 3 of these checkboxes again for that multiplication. Give it a try, hit pause, and then unpause when you're ready. Okay, what do you think? Let's do the sign rules first. First checkbox says negative times negative. Well, that's a positive, and you do need to put the plus sign here because it's going to be between terms. The only time you don't have to write the plus sign is if it's the very first term. So negative times negative is positive. Multiply my coefficients. 4 times 6, well, that's 24. And then I do my bases. If the bases are the same, I add the exponents. So x to the second power and x to the first power, I add the 2 and the 1, and I get x to the third power. And then last but not least, y to the power of 1, y to the power of 2. Those are like bases, so I get y to the power of 1 plus 2. is also 3. Did you get it? If so, great. If not, make sure you go back and understand why this has to be the second term here. I'm going to keep going here. I've got 2 more distributions to do. The next 2 are a little bit funny, but let's take a look. Now I'm going all the way over to this third term. So this guy times the negative 2x to the third power. Let's work it out. Starts off the same. Negative times negative is positive. I'm doing my signs. 4 times 2 is 8. Like bases, x to the second power, x to the third power. So 2 plus 3 is 5. And then, uh-oh, my y doesn't have anyone to combine with. That's okay. Don't panic. If that happens, you just bring it down. Y to the first power is just going to come straight down. There's nothing for it to combine with. The only thing is I don't write the exponent of 1 here. If your exponent is 1 or if your coefficient is 1 in your final answer, you just don't write it. Last but not least, we've got 1 more multiplication to do. And again, feel free to pause the video and see if you can do this one. Alright, let's see what you got. I'm multiplying all the way over to the plus 1y to the third power. Again, that 1 wasn't there originally. I had to write it in because I didn't see a coefficient. So positive times negative is negative. 4 times 1 is 4. Uh-oh, x doesn't have anything to combine with. Don't panic, just bring it down. If there's not another x over there, if you just have an x squared, just bring it down. Don't forget about it though, that's the only important thing. And then y to the first power times y to the third power, I add the exponents. 1 plus 3 is 4. And believe it or not, this whole ugly thing is my final answer. This is what you would type into Hawks or on the homework post, as awful as it seems. So to summarize, when you're multiplying polynomials, it's basically going to be this 3-step checklist for each time you're multiplying 2 terms. Do the sign rules for multiplication, multiply your coefficients, and add the exponents for like bases. In a lot of these, you're only going to have one kind of base. You'll just see x's. You won't see y's or anything else at all. I wanted to give you some more complicated ones here just so that you're prepared for them when you see them in Hawks. The main difficulty is just staying organized and being meticulous and not losing track of any of the details. You have to do these 3 things for every multiplication. For some of these, you're going to be multiplying by a fairly long polynomial with a lot of terms, so just run through those 3 things, every one of those multiplications. Alright, thank you for watching. In the next video, we're going to take a look at what happens when the first polynomial has more than one term, and it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's basically going to be the same steps.